135 cardinals, 42 nations. A room inside the apostolic palace where the air itself seemed to hold still. And in the centre of it all, a man who had been pope for only a matter of months. A man who had, until that morning, kept something locked inside him that no one in that room had fully expected him to say out loud. He had called them there, not for a ceremony, not for a vote, for a conversation, except that what he delivered was not a conversation. It was a reckoning, delivered without notes, without a prepared text on the lectern, just Pope Leo XIV, standing before the most powerful gathering of Catholic leadership on earth, and speaking from something deeper than a speech. By the time he finished, several cardinals were seen wiping their eyes. One senior prelate, a man not known for visible emotion, reportedly sat in silence for several minutes after the room began to empty. And a Vatican official who was present described what happened in a single phrase that would circulate through the corridors of the Holy See for days afterward. He said the Pope had spoken as though he had been waiting his whole life to say it. That morning changed things. What was said in that room, and what it revealed about who Pope Leo XIV actually is what this story is about. The background to that consistory begins not with Leo XIV, but with the institution he now leads, and with a silence that had been building inside the church for longer than most people realise. In the months leading up to the consistory, there had been a gathering tension inside the Vatican that outsiders could sense but rarely name precisely. The pontificate was still new. Leo XIV had moved with deliberateness since his election. Methodical, measured, never rushed. He had issued statements, he had travelled, he had met heads of state and embraced migrants on docks and prayed at shrines that had not seen a pope in decades. And through all of it, there was the sense, among journalists, among theologians, among the cardinals themselves, that the full account of what he believed, what he intended, what he feared for the church, had not yet been spoken plainly. Cardinals in particular had been waiting, some with hope, some with anxiety, some with the specific wariness of men who had served through multiple pontificates and had learned to read a pope's silences as carefully as his words. The consistory was announced with a formality that gave little away, a gathering of the College of Cardinals for reflection and consultation, as such gatherings are described in official Vatican language, routine on the surface. Except that nothing about the weeks that preceded it felt routine. The encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, had already been released. Its themes were clear to those who read carefully. A defence of the dignity of human beings, in an age that seemed increasingly willing to trade that dignity for efficiency, for ideology, for the comfort of certainty. But an encyclical is a document. It lives in paragraphs. It is studied in seminaries and footnoted in theological journals and cited in episcopal pastoral letters. What an encyclical cannot do by its nature is look a cardinal in the eye. That is what Leo XIV did that morning. The consistory opened in the usual manner. Prayers, a reading, the formal acknowledgement of the cardinals present, their names, their sees, their years of service to the church. These rituals are not empty. They are the grammar of Catholic institutional life, the way the church marks that something important is about to happen, and that everyone present is accountable to something larger than themselves. Then the Pope began to speak. He did not begin with doctrine. He did not begin with policy, or with the agenda items that had circulated beforehand. He began with something almost startlingly simple. He began with a question, not a rhetorical question, not the kind that is followed immediately by the speaker's own answer. A genuine question, addressed to the room, left hanging in the air without resolution. He asked the cardinals what they believed the church was most afraid of. The silence that followed was described by multiple accounts as lasting a full 30 seconds, which in a room of that size and formality is an extraordinary thing. Some cardinals looked at one another, some looked at the floor. And then Leo XIV answered his own question, and in answering it, he made clear that the silence had been precisely the point. The church, he said, pausing between words in a way that those present described as unlike his usual measured pace. The church is most afraid of being irrelevant. And that fear, he said, was the most dangerous thing about it. He did not say this with anger. Every account agrees on that. There was no edge of rebuke in the voice, no performer's calculation about how to land the line for effect. It was said the way a doctor might say something difficult to a patient, with the kind of directness that only becomes possible when the speaker has fully accepted the weight of what is true and has decided that the kindest thing is to say it plainly. And then he continued, and what came next was where the room began to change. What Leo XIV said next had to do with a distinction he drew, carefully, methodically, the way he does everything, between two kinds of relevance and between two kinds of fear. There is, he told the cardinals, a relevance that the world gives and the world can take away. This is the relevance of approval, the kind that is won when the Church aligns its voice with whatever the prevailing current of opinion happens to be moving toward. He acknowledged that this temptation exists on all sides of the theological spectrum. The conservative who wants the Church to be a fortress against modernity, and the progressive who wants it to be a mirror of modernity, are in his analysis making the same error. Both are allowing the outside world to set the terms. Both are, in a very real sense, afraid. Then there is a second kind of relevance, he said, and this is the only kind the Church was ever meant to pursue. It is not the relevance of agreement. It is the relevance of presence, of showing up, in the most literal sense, wherever a human being is suffering or searching or simply alive and trying to understand why. The Church, Leo XIV told the room, does not become relevant by winning arguments. It becomes relevant by accompanying people, and by trusting that the truth it carries is compelling enough to speak for itself, without the Church needing to dress it in the clothes of whatever cultural moment happens to be on the throne. This was not a new idea. Theologians would recognise the lineage immediately. It runs from John the 23rd through Paul VI through John Paul II. And Francis, the long Catholic argument about how the Church engages the world without being consumed by the world. But what struck those present was not the idea itself. It was the urgency with which Leo XIV spoke it, as though this were not a theological position being articulated for the record, but a conviction being defended against a real and present threat. Because the next thing he said made clear that in his view, the threat was real and it was present. He had been watching, he told them. He had been watching the Church make decisions, in dioceses, in episcopal conferences, in institutions both ancient and recently founded, that were driven not by discernment, but by anxiety. The anxiety of falling numbers. The anxiety of a culture that no longer automatically deferred to Catholic moral authority. The anxiety of empty pews and closed schools, and the particular quiet of a rectory that used to house 4 priests and now houses 1. He understood that anxiety. He was not dismissing it. He named it with a sympathy that, by all accounts, prevented the room from feeling accused. And then he said something that shifted the temperature again. He said, "The answer to an empty church is not a louder church. It is a truer one." That line landed. Descriptions of the moment converge on the same image. A slight shift in how the cardinals were sitting, the particular quality of stillness that falls over a room, when everyone present hears something they recognise as important and is not yet sure what to do with it. He let it sit. Then he went further. The specific decisions he was watching with concern, he told them, were decisions about communication, about how the Church presents itself to the world. He named social media. He named the temptation to chase engagement through controversy, to generate clicks and shares and trending discussions, not because those discussions served the mission, but because they produced the sensation of relevance. He said this quietly. He was not thundering. He was naming something he had seen, in the behaviour of Catholic media personalities, in the way some bishops had begun to use public statements as political instruments, in the drift toward performance over substance, that he regarded as a corruption not of faith, but of the institutional character of the Church. And this is the moment that most accounts identify as the turning point of the morning. He brought it back to himself. He told the cardinals that he had been silent on certain questions not because he lacked views on them, but because he had been deciding how to speak about them. That there is a kind of silence that is cowardice, and a kind of silence that is preparation, and he had been attempting to practice the second kind, though he acknowledged that the line between the two is not always easy to locate from the inside. He said there were things he had seen in the first months of this pontificate that had made him glad, and things that had made him grieve, and things that had made him uncertain in ways he had not expected. He named uncertainty, not as a weakness, but as an honest account of what governing a church of nearly 1.5 billion people actually feels like from where he was standing. For a pope to say this to his cardinals, to stand in front of the college and name his own uncertainty without immediately resolving it into confidence, is unusual. The papacy has a grammar of its own, and that grammar is built around authority. Popes teach, they define, they pronounce. The tradition is ancient and deep, and it serves real purposes. A church of that size, spread across every culture and language on earth, needs clarity. It needs an anchor. It needs to know that somewhere at the centre of the institution there is someone who will not be blown about by every wind of opinion. Leo XIV knows this. The cardinals know he knows this. Which is why what he did next, the moment that will be discussed for a long time after the morning is formally concluded, had the weight that it did. He asked them for something, not for loyalty, not for compliance, not for the management of their respective dioceses in accordance with the directions he was about to issue. He asked them for something that is harder than any of those things, and rarer in any institution of this size and age. He asked them for honesty. He told them, and accounts differ slightly on the exact phrasing, but agree on the substance, that a pope surrounded by people who tell him only what they believe he wants to hear is a pope who is already beginning to fail. That the history of the Church is not short on examples of this pattern, and the outcomes have not been good for the Church, for the faithful, or for the popes themselves. He was not inviting dissent. He was not opening a floor for theological debate in which every teaching was on the table. He was specific. He wanted to know what the cardinals were actually encountering in their dioceses, in their conversations with priests and laity, and people who had left the Church and people who had never entered it. He wanted their honest assessment, not the assessment calibrated to what they imagined he needed to hear, the real one. This was not merely a request for better reporting mechanisms. It was a statement about how he intended to govern, and, implicitly, a statement about how he believed the Church had sometimes been governed in ways that had cost it dearly. The cardinal who spoke first after this, an African prelate who has served his diocese for more than 20 years and who is not known for speaking before he is ready, asked a simple question. He asked whether Leo XIV was prepared for what honest answers might contain. The Pope looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "That is exactly the right question, and the answer is yes." And then he added something quieter, something that several cardinals later reflected on, as the most personally revealing thing said in the entire session. He said that he had been a priest long enough to know that the truth is rarely as destructive as the fear of the truth, and that the Church had, at various points in its history, made the catastrophic error of treating silence as protection, when what it was actually doing was building pressure that would eventually find its own release, usually at the worst possible time. He was not speaking abstractly. Everyone in that room understood the weight of the institutional history he was referencing. The room held it quietly, without anyone needing to name what he meant. The session continued for several hours. What followed the opening statement was, by accounts, a genuine exchange, not a performance of consultation, but an actual one, with cardinals raising concerns they had not voiced publicly, with tensions between different visions of how the Church should be moving that had been simmering in the background of the pontificate, given room to surface and be named. There was a moment, reported by more than one person who was present, that arrived about 2 hours into the session, during a discussion that had become quite direct about the question of how the Church communicates with young people who have effectively already left. A cardinal from a heavily secularised Western country had been speaking honestly about the scale of the departure, numbers that were not news to anyone in the room, but that had been stated with a bluntness that had shifted the emotional register of the conversation. The room had gone quiet again, one of those pauses that can tip either toward despair or toward something else. And then a younger cardinal, newly elevated, from a country where the Church is growing, said something that he had apparently prepared to say, and chose to say in that moment. He said that in his experience, the people most drawn to the Church in recent years were not drawn by its arguments. They were drawn by its examples, by the specific human beings they had encountered, who seemed to be living in a way that was different, not superior, not louder, not more certain, but different, in the sense of oriented, towards something that gave them a quality of peace and a capacity for presence that struck the people around them as worth investigating. The silence after he said this was different from the earlier silences. It was the silence of recognition. And then Leo XIV said something that those present have described consistently, in the days since, as the line they have not been able to stop thinking about. He said, "We have spent a great deal of time trying to explain what we believe. Perhaps we have not spent enough time simply being what we believe." There is a small thing that happened at the end of the Consistory that did not appear in the official Vatican summary, but that has circulated in the accounts of those who were present. After the formal session concluded and the room began to move, cardinals gathering their things, conversations beginning in clusters, the particular low murmur of a large institutional gathering returning to itself, Leo XIV did not leave immediately. He walked, unhurriedly, to where the cardinal from the secularised Western country was still sitting. The man had not gotten up yet. He was looking at the table in front of him, in the way of someone who is processing something that has not yet resolved itself. The Pope sat down next to him. He did not say anything immediately. He simply sat with him for a moment, in the way that one might sit with a friend who has just said something honest and difficult, and does not need a response so much as the simple evidence that they have not been left alone in having said it. They spoke quietly for a few minutes, in a conversation that was private, and that no one present tried to record or report on in detail, respecting what it was. What was visible was the way the cardinal eventually nodded, not the nod of someone who has been convinced of something, but the nod of someone who has been accompanied, who has been, in the most literal sense, met. When Leo XIV finally left the room, the last thing he did was pause at the door and look back. At the room, at the cardinals still gathered in their conversations. It was a brief pause. Then he was gone. The question that has surrounded this consistory in the days since, in Vatican media, in the conversations of theologians, in the reflections of people who follow the church from the outside without belonging to it, is what it means for the direction of this pontificate. Some have read it as a signal of coming change. Others have read it as a clarification of continuity. Leo XIV grounding himself and his cardinals in a vision of the church that he regards as foundational, before moving into whatever comes next. Still others have noted that what he said resists being mapped easily onto the categories of progressive or conservative, reform or tradition, that Catholic journalism tends to reach for. And this may be, in the end, the most revealing thing about what happened in that room. Because the categories that structure most public discussion of the Catholic Church, the axes of left and right, of liberal and conservative, of those who want change and those who want stability, all of them assume that the central question facing the institution is essentially a political one. A question about power, about who wins and who loses in the contest over doctrine and practice and the direction of the institution. What Leo XIV said in that consistory was not about any of those things, or rather, it was about all of them, but not in the way those categories expect. He was not moving pieces on the board. He was questioning whether the board itself, and the habit of thinking that reduces everything to pieces and moves, was part of what the church needed to examine. He was asking whether the church's crisis, insofar as it has one, is primarily a strategic crisis or primarily a spiritual one. And his answer, delivered without drama over several hours to the most powerful gathering of Catholic leadership on earth, was clear. It is a spiritual one, and the strategies that treat it as anything else are, in his view, likely to make it worse. There is something in the history of papal consistories that is worth understanding to grasp why this particular one has registered the way it has. The College of Cardinals is not, in most people's understanding, a body that gets spoken to plainly. It is a body of princes of the church, a phrase that carries its weight deliberately. These are men who have risen through one of the most hierarchical institutions in human civilization. They have learned, by long experience, to read tone and implication and the space between words. They are sophisticated readers of institutional communication, which is why what Leo XIV did, the choice to speak without a prepared text, to ask a genuine question and hold the silence after it, to name his own uncertainty and ask for honesty in return, landed with the force it did. These were not diplomatic gestures, they were departures from the grammar that usually governs this kind of gathering. And when a pope departs from that grammar, in a room full of people who know that grammar better than almost anyone on earth, the departure is noticed. What was noticed, most essentially, was not the content of any specific statement. It was the manner, the quality of the speaker's relationship to what he was saying. The sense, difficult to articulate, but consistently reported by those present, that this was not a man performing a role, but a man speaking from the place where his role and his person had, at some point in his formation, become the same thing. That is a rare quality in institutional leadership. It tends to produce a particular response in people who encounter it. Not necessarily agreement, but something that precedes agreement. The experience of being in the presence of someone whose words can be trusted to correspond to what they actually think, which is the necessary precondition for any real conversation. And perhaps that, more than any specific policy implication, is what the cardinals took from the room. The sense that the conversation the church needs to have, with itself, with the world, with the people it has lost and the people it has not yet reached, might be more possible now than it was before. In the days since the consistory, there has been a particular kind of attention in Vatican circles to what comes next. What documents will follow? What appointments? What signals in the language of synods and episcopal assemblies, and the long, patient machinery of Catholic institutional life? These are legitimate questions. The consistory will eventually produce consequences that can be measured and tracked and analysed. But there is another way to think about what happened in that room, one that does not reduce it to its institutional outputs. It is the way that the cardinal from the heavily secularised country, in an account shared with a colleague, apparently described it when asked what he took from the morning. He said that he had entered the room carrying a weight that he had been carrying for a long time, the weight of numbers that do not improve, of a territory where the church is present in buildings that are older than the nation itself but absent from the lives of most of the people who live near those buildings. He said that this weight had not gotten lighter when he left the room. The numbers had not changed, the territory was the same, but something else had changed. He could not fully name it. He said it was something like this. He had felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was not carrying the weight alone. That the man at the centre of the institution understood what it actually felt like to stand in that territory and face those numbers and ask what the church is for and whether it is doing it. And that this man, this pope, was not going to offer him a strategy that papered over the difficulty. He was going to sit with the difficulty, and in sitting with it, make it possible for others to sit with it honestly too. That, the cardinal said, was what he took from the room. Not a solution, not a plan. Something that perhaps has to come before plans, if plans are going to be worth anything. He took home the sense that he was not alone in what he was facing. In the Catholic theological tradition, there is an idea, old and deep and found in various forms across the history of the Church, that the most important thing a leader can give to those he leads is not instruction but witness. The idea that leadership, at its most essential, is not about the transmission of information or the exercise of authority, but about the embodiment of a way of being that others can recognise as real and can orient themselves toward. This idea sits in some tension with the way institutions actually function, which necessarily requires instruction and authority. The Church cannot operate on witness alone. It has sacraments to administer, doctrine to transmit, an ancient and complex body of teaching to pass on intact to the next generation. These things require clarity and structure and the kind of authority that can be named and located and appealed to. But the insight that has been articulated in one form or another by virtually every major figure in the history of Catholic spirituality is that this structure, however necessary, is not the point. It is in service of something that cannot be structured, the encounter between a human being and the living truth that the Church exists to carry. And that encounter, when it happens, tends not to happen because a person was convinced by an argument or an institution. It tends to happen because they met someone in whom that truth was, in some palpable way, alive. What those who were present in the Consistory seem to be saying, in their different ways, is that this is what they encountered in Leo XIV that morning. Not a superior argument, not a better strategy. Something more like the thing itself. A man shaped by decades of priestly life in which the gap between the role and the person had slowly, over time and through difficulty, closed. Whether that quality can be transmitted at the scale of a universal church is a fair question. Whether a consistory, however remarkable, can become a movement is a question that only time will answer. These are real uncertainties, and Leo XIV named them as such. But there is something that happens when an institution, at its highest level, encounters genuine authenticity. When the person standing at the centre of all that power and history and ritual speaks from the actual interior of their experience, rather than from the performed surface of their role. Something shifts, not immediately, not in ways that show up in statistics or vote counts or trend lines, but something shifts. A room changes when that happens. The people in it change slightly. They carry something out with them that they did not carry in. And then, in ways that cannot be planned or predicted, that thing moves. Pope Leo XIV left the consistory and returned to the private rhythms of the pontificate that the world sees only partially. The meetings, the prayers, the documents, the particular quality of attention that the papacy requires, which is total and which leaves very little space for anything that is not the work. But those who saw him in the days after, those who encounter him in the normal course of Vatican life, who see him in the corridors and at the morning mass and in the small moments that do not reach the wire services, described something in him that was perhaps more visible than usual in the immediate aftermath of the consistory. They described a kind of quiet. Not the quiet of withdrawal, but the quiet of someone who has said something that needed to be said and has set it down. The quiet of a man who has been carrying something toward a particular moment, and has, when the moment arrived, delivered it honestly, and now finds himself on the other side of that effort, lighter, perhaps, in the particular way of people who have done the thing they were preparing to do. One priest who crosses paths with Leo XIV regularly, and who was asked to describe what he had observed in the week after the consistory, paused for a long time before answering. Then he said something that captures, perhaps, the essence of what this pontificate is becoming, and what that morning in the consistory was part of. He said he seemed like someone who had told the truth and survived it. That is not a small thing. In the life of any institution, and perhaps especially in the life of the oldest continuous institution in the Western world, the telling of the truth, plainly to the people who need to hear it in the room that matters, is an act that requires a particular kind of courage. Not the courage of confrontation, the courage of clarity, the courage of being willing to stand in the centre of everything the institution represents and say without performance and without deflection what is actually true. Leo XIV did that. A room of 135 cardinals heard it. And the conversation that follows, the long, slow, necessary conversation about what the Church is for and how it becomes what it is meant to be, is now, in some sense, different than it was before. That is not the ending of a story. It is a beginning. And that is where this one leaves off. Not with a resolution, because the story is not finished, but with the sense that something has shifted, that a pope stood up in front of the most powerful gathering of the institution he leads and said what he actually believed, asked for what he actually needed and modelled, in the act of doing so, the very thing he was calling for. A church that is not afraid to be honest. A church that trusts the truth it carries enough to speak it plainly. A church that, in the end, is worth accompanying, because the people at its centre are willing to be accompanied themselves. That is the thing he told the cardinals. And it is, perhaps, the thing worth carrying forward. For those who want to follow every development of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate, the speeches, the decisions, the moments that don't make the front page but that shape what the Church is becoming, subscribe so none of it is missed. And leave a comment below, which moment from this story stayed with the longest. God bless.